So welcome to my channel. This is your host, and today we're going to be looking at one of my favorite paintings, The Nurse by Dirks van Babuur. It's also known as Chiron and Pero, or Father and Daughter, but I prefer The Nurse because it's more inclusive. So we're going to be talking about it in that way. The painting is now housed in the Louvre Museum in Paris, and is part of the Baroque period in European art history. Now, if you've been following for any length of time, then you'll know that I love me some Baroque art. Give me all the drama, the intricate detail, the complex compositions, and the highly skilled brushwork. If you want to know more about Baroque art, then why not check out my introduction to Baroque art video where I run through the key features of this amazing period. But as always, let's start with the story behind this painting. So the story comes from a Roman historian called Valerius Maximus who lived around the 1st century AD. He wrote a book called Factorum, and it was a collection of stories that were meant to be exemplary and praiseworthy. In other words, stories that were meant to teach a lesson about how one should live their life. The story that we're looking at today tells us about a woman called Pero, whose father Cain had been sentenced to death by starvation for being an informer, someone who gave evidence against others in exchange for money. As Valerius Maximus tells the story, Cain had previously been warned about the dangers of being an informer, but he turned a deaf ear to these warnings and continued to do what he was doing. So eventually he got caught up in a conspiracy against the Emperor Caligula and was arrested. Apparently, he tried to escape, but they caught him and then threw him into prison and decided that he was going to die by starvation. Now, in those days, prisoners who were sentenced to death by starvation were chained up and then left without food and water, and they were only given water just before death so that they would have the strength to carry out the final act of humiliation, which was to have their mouths sewn up so that their screams would be muffled. Anyway, when Cain was in prison awaiting his fate, his daughter Pero came to see him. She brought him food and water and tried to nurse him back to health, and she hid him under her cloak, trying to keep him warm as best as she could. But as the days passed, she realized that her father wasn't going to make it. So she managed to get the permission of the guards to spend the night with her father in the prison. And then when the next morning arrived and the guards came to take him away to be executed, they found Pero kneeling beside her father's cell, still holding him close to her. So apparently she had stayed true to her word and hadn't left her father's side. When the guards told her that her father was dead and was going to be taken away to be executed, she replied that if they took him away, they would have to take her along with him. Because, when she made her promise to stay with her father until death, she wasn't just referring to his physical death. She would go with him wherever he went. And since executioners had to carry the condemned to their deaths, she would go with him there too. Of course, the guards couldn't actually take them both, so they did something that I can only call magnanimous, which was to allow her to stay with her father for as long as she wanted to. So the story ends with her remaining by his side, nursing him as the executioners prepared him for death, and she remained with him until his body was finally taken away. So the episode of Cain and Pero became quite famous during the Renaissance period and after, especially in Northern Europe, when it was seen as an example of the highest form of Christian virtue. When we look at the painting though, we can see that Ter Brugghen doesn't actually show us the moment when Pero makes her promise to stay with her father. He skips over that bit of the story and instead focuses on the aftermath of this decision. We find her kneeling beside her father's cell, holding him close as she nurses him back to health. She has wrapped her cloak around his shoulders to try and keep him warm, and has put her head on his knee, indicating the closeness of their relationship and the tenderness that exists between them. Her hand is on his chest and she's looking down at him with great concern, anxiously waiting for his return to health. Now, Chiron is completely naked, except for the shackles that are holding his hands behind his back, and there is no doubt that this is meant to remind us of his shameful crime of being an informer. Also, it helps to emphasize the idea that he is helpless right now and entirely reliant on his daughter to help him. His body is emaciated, which shows us how much weight he has lost and probably also alludes to his former occupation as a soldier, as there was a belief in the Renaissance that muscular athletic bodies were emblematic of the classical past. But even though the title of the painting tells us that this is supposed to be an image of fatherhood and childhood, there's a sense in which we shouldn't really see this as a father and daughter, but rather as a husband and wife. There's a very intimate relationship between them, and it's hard to imagine that they aren't married. And in fact, one commentator in the 17th century said as much. He called the painting an image of conjugal love rather than familial love. And it is clear that Ter Brugghen did intend this to be a straightforward image of a father and daughter. Instead, he wanted to highlight the devotion and commitment that existed between them, whatever the nature of their relationship. In fact, when we look closely at the painting, we see a number of details that indicate that this isn't just a simple family scene. First, we have the contrast between light and dark. You might think this is simply because it's nighttime, but that's not really the case. The reason for the darkness is actually to hide a secret, namely that the woman is stealing food and water from somewhere and bringing it to her lover. The way that the light spills across the picture plane and illuminates both figures draws our attention to the central point of the composition, which is the couple, and it also creates a dramatic effect. Then we have the background. There's this one element in particular that we need to talk about, and that's the figure peering at them from above. See if you can spot him. Ready? Here, I'll give you a hint. Look above the head of the seated man. There he is. A guard, or perhaps a voyeur. He's hiding in the shadows and spying on the couple, watching them as they embrace. He holds a lantern in one hand and the cord used to pull it above him in the other, and it's clear that he's attempting to remain hidden, crouching as he is and pulling the cord tight. Now, this figure adds another layer of complexity to the painting, because he reminds us that the couple are being watched. And that knowledge should encourage us to consider what it is that we're seeing. Is it a father and daughter genuinely embracing in a loving way, or is it something more scandalous? And furthermore, it encourages us to think about who is watching this scene and what power dynamics are at play. For example, is the man in the shadows a guard who will report the couple's actions to the authorities, or is he just a curious onlooker? Well, the answer to the second question is probably yes, but I think the first one is too. And I think it is likely that the guard or the goddess presence is meant to add an element of danger to the piece. In other words, even though it looks like everything is fine at the moment, the couple have broken the law, and there is a possibility that things could change. And then there's the issue of the kiss. Is it appropriate? What does it say about their relationship, and what might happen if someone else finds out about it? Of course, we can't know exactly what Ter Brugghen intended when he painted this scene, but we do know that kissing wasn't uncommon in 17th century Dutch paintings. And this painting was actually quite controversial when it was first shown. And the reason for that controversy was actually quite simple. It was the kiss. In fact, there was so much scandal surrounding this work that Ter Brugghen was accused of corrupting the youth because of the suggestive nature of his painting. But despite the controversy, we can see that the kiss is important to the painting, because it reveals the emotional connection between the two main figures. After all, a kiss is a gesture that requires trust, intimacy, and vulnerability. It's an intensely personal thing and not something that people do lightly. Also, when we look at the kiss, we can see that the woman is actively initiating it. She's the one who throws her head back and opens her mouth, which indicates that there's a strong dynamic at play here. She's not just passively receiving the kiss, but she's actively engaging with her father or her lover. And it's clear that the kiss means a great deal to her. In fact, she looks as though she might be about to faint. She's that absorbed in the moment. And while we don't know the full story behind this painting, and while it's possible to read it in a variety of ways, I think the kiss is a key moment that allows us to understand the depth of feeling that Ter Brugghen was trying to convey. In the end, the painting celebrates the power of love and devotion, but it does so in a way that acknowledges the potential dangers that come with expressing such emotions. After all, the couple are breaking the law and are subject to the whims of the gods. But it is their love for each other that drives their actions and makes them willing to risk everything. If you'd like to learn more about Baroque art, then please do check out my introduction to Baroque art video. And while you're there, make sure to subscribe if you haven't done so already. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.